Hi, and welcome back to Egoless. So today we're going to develop a frequently asked questions section. These are questions that we get asked frequently. And we're going to start off very, very simply with what is the ego? So Karen, I'd like to ask you, what is the ego to you? And how do you relate to your ego?
Well, to me, the ego is the ongoing chatter that's going on inside of our head. It's our internal dialogue, our thinker that everybody has, and it interrupts in life. So it actually kind of taints our daily experience of life because it's always polluting our minds with all this extra noise.
So when you use words like polluting, it sounds like you're referring to the ego as being negative. Is that how you experience the ego most of the time?
Not all the time, but sometimes. Of course, we all sometimes have negative thoughts in our head, but a lot of times we also have positive thoughts in our head or just extra thoughts in our head, like excessive thoughts in our head that really just crowd our minds and they conflict just with being present and enjoying our life. Our ego, it always lives in the past and in the future. So it really keeps us out of the now, which is where life is really happening. So it's not always negative, but it's just loud and it disturbs life, the ego. And there's a lot more to it that we talk about in the journey and on the app. There's a lot of different facets to the ego. But if you were to ask me to sum it up in a nutshell, that's how I would describe the ego.
Would you mind if I ask you to unpack a few more things for us out of that?
Sure.
So, so it sounds like when you describe your ego, it sounds like your ego's become more positive and less negative over time. Would you describe that as true?
Totally. Yeah. First, before when you don't have control of your ego, it's just reactive thought or conditioned thought. Just based on our upbringing, based on our default. When our ego is not under our control, it's really just random, aimless, reactive thought. Whereas once you start focusing on your ego and you really start taming the dragon, that's when you start to change the whole lingo of it. You start changing your own inner dialogue. You have much more conscious control over it.
So it sounds to me like what you're saying is that for you, the process of becoming more egoless is both a combination of your ego becoming more friendly and more conditioned not to give you lots of negative inputs and to give you increasingly positive inputs. Would you say that's fair?
Absolutely. Yeah, and that's really what the whole journey is about on the Egoless app is that it's a combination of two things. So one, you're starting to quiet your mind, you're quieting your ego, you're starting to, like I said, tame the dragon. And the other one is you're starting to rewrite your own inner script, starting to change your own story. So it's a combination of those two things, turning down the volume on your ego and changing the context of your ego. So Adrian, how would you describe your ego?
So I think a lot of the way that you see your ego and the way I see my ego is a lot the same. So I see ego as very sort of primitive, defensive part of the brain. It's concerned with keeping you safe, keeping you away from predators, making sure that you have access to security, whether that's a money flow or that's people surrounding you, and it's really not about taking risks. It's very reluctant to allow you to do things in life that mean taking on risks in any way. So the ego, to me, is for the most part, is my first impression of it is that critic that's always fearful of the future and scolding of past mistakes that resulted in sort of less security or less well-being. And so that's kind of where my ego kind of started out. And I think for a lot of people, that's kind of what they hear. A lot of inner noise, as you were mentioning, but a lot of it's around security, a lot of it's around not being hurt, and a lot of it's around not taking risks, a lot of it's around fear. And so for me, quietening that ego down so that I can actually process my own thoughts without these pervasive, intrusive fear or anxiety coming through into my thinking is a super important part of the journey. And then, as you mentioned, as you can get a bit of a handle on your ego and start understanding the way that you interact with yourself, having that ego become increasingly more positive, recognizing that recognizing that carefully adjusted risks and careful living of life within your code allows you to be successful and changes that dialogue more and more into something positive and something that really has your back, as opposed to something that's undermining you all the time.
The ego is really about our sense of survival, in a way, the survival of ourself, and its job is to keep us safe. So as you were saying too about the ego not wanting to take risks, and just to protect us, because the ego is always afraid of what it doesn't know. And do you find in your own life, Adrian, that as soon as you almost challenge your ego and face your fears and push through them anyway, despite the chatter of your ego, despite all the don't do it's going on in your mind, that's when you start to transition and change the nature of your ego, kind of expand your ego's comfort zone?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think when you give in to your ego, when your ego says don't do it and you don't do it, the chances of the next time you're faced with the same situation and the ego says don't do it, you're going to react to that more like, yes, I almost did it before and I didn't do it, and now I'm not going to do it again.
And your ego gets bigger and bigger.
Or gets more influential around that particular piece, right? And you know, the ego works through some of our very primitive feelings and anxiety, fear, distress, lack of safety. Those kinds of feelings come up, and when the ego manages to successfully attach those feelings to any decision, especially a decision that you don't actually end up making, it sort of anchors that fear to that sort of decision type. And so when you actually work through it and you actually do it, and all those things that you were scared about don't actually happen, then the next time that question comes up, the ego has less validity and has less strength, and you've sort of started cutting chains or cutting ties to that ego-driven, fear-based sort of drive, and so it gradually makes you more liberated, gradually makes you more able to take on things with greater comfort that are all essentially about the same level of like challenge or risk that you might have had difficulty taking on before.
So that's kind of the gist of both of our perceptions of the ego. We would love to hear yours. Please feel free to email us. Our contact information will all be at the end of this video. We love to hear from our users and members.
Thank you very much for joining us, and take the time to be aware of your inner chatter and help you quiet that monkey mind.